What's going on today, guys? This is Jimmy, your host, and today we're going to be talking about overclocking. Overclocking is like the one thing that all PC enthusiasts should be doing. I mean, God, if you're water cooling a PC and you're not overclocking it, then please, just sell all of it. Just sell your PC. And for some of you who don't know what overclocking is, and God, I hope if you're from PC Gaming 101 and you don't know what overclocking is, then you've been living under a rock for quite a while. Anyways, overclocking is basically just taking that component in your computer, usually RAM, CPU, and your graphics cards, and pushing them farther than the design specifications of that card, CPU die, or RAM set. But when overclocking, stability issues become a problem, the longevity of the component, heat is probably the biggest thing, and the next biggest thing is probably power consumption, because every single graphics card, every single CPU has a thing called a TDP or a max TDP. TDP stands for thermal power design, and is basically what, how much power the CPU, GPU, or RAM is going to pull. RAM really doesn't have, a TDP. It's not really a high power draw component. But on the downside, GPUs tend to be the more power hungry components in your computer. And if you're like me, your 8350 pulls almost 300 watts from your power supply. So the key to overclocking, the things you want to know is the maximum voltage that you can push that component to. Is your cooler good enough? Can it, support how much heat that thing is going to be outputting? And do you have the proper power supply? Do you have the proper motherboard? Do you actually have the proper component? Because I know for a fact some of the Phantom series, they were all unlocked, I think. And I only got mine to like 4.2 gigahertz, and it wouldn't overclock any further. I guess it wasn't a good overclocker. And I don't know if that was typical or it was just the way the chip was designed, just so you couldn't hurt it. And you know what? That chip pulled a lot of power, but it only got to about 55 degrees. And that was more than acceptable for me. Now my 8350 on the other hand it's a 125 watt TDP also CPU, and I think it pulls about 250 to 300 watts. I'm running it at 5.3 gigahertz. It has a TJ max temperature, I think, of 80 degrees. I only let it get up to about 75, so my fans get up to like 100% on my H100i when it hits about 70 degrees, just so it doesn't go up. I'm kind of anal about stuff like that, but other than that, the CPU seems to be working fine. I haven't really run into stability problems other than when I was first figuring out the voltages. Now, if you're going to be running an 8350 at as high of a clock speed as I am, and God, please don't, you're going to need like overclocking, like military grade components. Your motherboard is going to need to be some overclocking certified motherboard, and I'm not talking about like an M-Power board, just some plain old Asus with, it can overclock. I have a Crosshair 5 Formula Z, and it's pushing the board, and that's like made for liquid nitrogen overclocking. It was actually the board that AMD got their 8150 to 8.5 gigahertz, so that's why I use this board, and it also looks killer. So things for CPUs need to watch out for is thermal power, and just your motherboard. You could burn out a motherboard. I remember when Prescott came out, 45 nanometer i7s, they ran so hot and drew so much power, like the i7 950, it would just, the back of motherboards would be like brown. It literally would burn boards out. Now CPUs seem to be the one part where you can overclock and get a lot of performance out of it. It's more beneficial than it would be to overclock your graphics card, and especially your RAM. My CPU at 5.3 GHz is actually faster than an i7 3770K, but once you overclock i7 3770K, it's better. Yeah, it's gonna be faster, but it's really close. And I think if you spend a little more money on the board and the cooler, you could actually get a better price with an 8350 overclock, and you get 8 cores. You get 8 true cores, and you'll have, I don't know, it's kind of a fanboy thing. I like Intel, I like AMD. I don't care. For me, it's just whatever works. I actually had an i7 3770K, and I sold it because I wasn't satisfied with how much performance gain I got. I literally could not tell. So moving on, now we're going to be doing GPUs. GPUs are a lot different. They're not as sensitive, and overclocking utilities, like in Windows, are a lot more common for GPUs. I don't think I've ever tried BIOS overclocking on a GPU, and it just seems to be the modern way to go. Now, every generation, some cards are really good overclockers, like the HD 7000 series, just the last gen from AMD. You literally, if your cooler was good enough, like even stock cards, I have 2 stock 7970s, you just take those sliders on MSI Afterburner or whatever you're using, and you just slide them all the way to the right. And yeah, make sure your fans were running at 100% when you're under load, because they will get really hot, and you're good to go. Literally, they were the easiest overclockers. But on the NVIDIA side, NVIDIA is really kind of, you got limited voltage. You can't overvolt the GPUs unless you get like a Hawk edition or some kind of special edition card from either MSI, Asus, any of those manufacturers. A great example of a terribly overclocking card is the GTX 400 series. I had a 480, actually had 3 480s, and well, to begin with, they already ran at 105 degrees Celsius, and second, they just did not overclock. You couldn't push them, and my god, did those cards pull just absolutely insane amount of power. They pulled more power than my CPU does. One of them did, and it's ridiculous. I couldn't deal with it. I had a 800 watt power supply, and I had to upgrade, and I just couldn't deal with the power demand. It was just ridiculous. But the key thing you really need to be watching out with GPUs is your temperature. GPUs are a lot easier overclockers. You literally just have to play with the dials. It won't crash or anything unless you try really stressing the computer if you don't know what you're doing when you're overclocking a GPU, or GPUs in my case. But it's just a lot easier, and that's more what I'd recommend trying and messing around with before you move to your CPU. And also with these, make sure you have an adequate power supply. My 7970s, perfect overclockers. I turned my dials all the way to the end, 1200 megahertz on the core, 1575 on the memory, and I just turned the voltage up all the way. I just turned everything up the way, the power limit to 20%, and I made my own custom fan curve on MSI Afterburner, which anybody can do. Now let's move on to RAM. RAM is really weird. I don't overclock my RAM. I just leave it at the default in my case, which is 1866. There is absolutely no benefit to overclocking your RAM in gaming and even video editing, but there has been studies showing that it does help in simulation software, like Autodesk simulation softwares. I don't have any, but I've just heard, and I believe it because that would make sense since they are extremely memory dependent programs. Also, Corsair did a study, and George from Corsair, if you watch Linus Tech Tips, found that higher frequency memory actually is giving a benefit in Battlefield 4. Battlefield 4 is actually an extremely memory dependent game. I've found out I'm using about 6 to 8 gigabytes on average on Battlefield 4, and according to them, higher megahertz memory is benefiting 10-20% depending on the speed you have. But I really couldn't tell you a lot about overclocking RAM. That's something else you would have to look up. I'm not technically an expert on any of this. I just have quite a bit of experience, and I know how to get my way around all this kind of stuff. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you like it, like it. If you disliked it, dislike it. And leave us some feedback in the comments thinking what you thought about the video and future topics to discuss about. Have a great day, you guys, and remember, I don't know, just remember something. See ya! M5A 7L or 780 LX3 Deluxe motherboard. Wait a minute. Oh,